Greetings, lovers of lore! Thank you for joining me for the first installment of the Brothers War lore. This is my absolute favorite storyline in all of Magic the Gathering's history, so I hope that you enjoy it as much as I do. Now, when it comes to the recorded histories of the Brothers War, nothing is known about the first few years of Urza and Mishra's life. When we encounter them in the story, they are between the age of 10 and 12 years old. They hail from the Argivian city of Pendragon, where they are actually the children of a nobleman. Unfortunately, their father has become very ill, and their stepmother has children from another family and really is only interested in the family fortunes. And the boys are essentially cast out of their noble home with no money and nothing to do except find their way out into the Argivian desert camp to find someone by the name of Tokasia, who was a friend of their father. So the two boys end up making a deal with someone known as Wagon Master Bly. This is a trader who heads out into the desert taking goods to the desert campsite in exchange for items that he can bring back and sell in the city. Now, Bly is an opportunist, so he takes advantage of the boys and basically says that as long as they work really hard, that he will take them with him on this trip. The boys agree to this deal, not realizing that Bly's intention was to take advantage of the boys, using their labor both for the trip out and the trip back without letting them know ahead of time. So when they arrived at the encampment and Bly made it known that he expected them to continue working for him, at that point there was a confrontation between the two boys and Bly. So our story really starts with an argument between two small boys who would rock the foundation of Dominaria and one greedy wagon master. We have Mishra, who is more rambunctious, has dark hair and a more stout body, and Urza, who is more serious with a thinner frame and blonde hair. After attempting to say goodbye to the wagon master, Bly went into a thunderous rage, which Mishra shrank away from. The more Bly yelled, the more Mishra shrank back behind Urza. By contrast, Urza stood proud and straight-backed as Bly accused them of trickery. "Get back to work unloading the carts, you motherless dogs!" This was enough to ignite Mishra's anger, and he actually took a step forward towards Bly, his fists clenching. Urza calmly reached out a hand and placed it on his brother's shoulder. Looking Bly directly in the eyes, he said, "We had a deal. We would work to pay for our trip. We have arrived. Our deal is done." Bly roared back, "You agreed to help for the journey. The journey is only half done. We still have to go back to Pendragon." Mishra's anger was still simmering, and he yelled back at Bly, "That defeats the entire purpose of us coming here!" The argument was interrupted by an older lady wearing a pair of spectacles and leaning on a walking stick that looked like it was made out of broken wood and some unknown metal. The newcomer spoke to the wagon master. "What's going on here, Bly?" Bly's voice switched from anger to half obsequiousness in a heartbeat when he recognized her. "A small private matter. Hardly worth your time, Mistress Tokasia." At the mention of her name, Urza turned to pull a letter out from under his jacket. Offering it to her, he said, "I am Urza. This is Mishra." The letter he held out bore the seal of his noble house. Tokasia reached over and took the letter. After scanning the letter, she abruptly told the boys, "Gather your things." In the background, Bly sputtered, "They owe me work." Tokasia ignored that. "What's going on with the boys' family in Pendragon?" Bly filled her in on the father and mother situation and how the boys had essentially been cast adrift. Tokasia looked at him disdainfully. "So you meant to keep the boys, assuming that no one would care what happened to them. I expected better of you." The boys did not settle well into the camp at first. In fact, they got into a fight within the first hour of being there. What happened was Mishra ended up sitting on a bunk that wasn't his. One of the other boys got quite angry about it, and a confrontation ensued, with Urza ending up defending his brother Mishra. Takasia was called in to handle the situation and ultimately said, Urza, you are the eldest brother, correct? Urza nodded, but at the same time Mishra made a face, and Urza went on to explain that we were both born in the same year. I was born on the first day of the year, Mishra was born on the last day. This correction mollified Mishra, and he piped in, on the last day of the year, we're equal. Takasia nodded. Your father has entrusted you to my care, and he was a dear friend of mine. This camp will be your new home, unless you wish to go back with Bly. At this, the boys exchanged glances, and Mishra asked Takasia, what do you do here? Takasia responded, we hunt for ancient artifacts. Urza nodded and chimed in, relics of a pre-Argive civilization. Mishra jumped in, is that what those strange white beasts are? Takasia smiled, yes, the onulets, but these were not dug up relics. I built them from schematics created by studying the broken pieces of Thran artifacts that we've already uncovered. They never need rest or food, and if something ever happens and one is no longer functional, the fluid that flows within their joints can be used to create elixirs of vitality that we trade with the desert people. I'm impressed you could tell they weren't real animals. Usually one of the pranks played on newcomers is that they're told to feed the onulets and not come back until the onulets have been fed. How did you guess? I just felt it, Mishra said, shrugging it off. Urza interjected, the way they move is unnatural and unbalanced. I noticed immediately, but it hardly seemed worth commenting on. The Thran's creations are wondrous. Takasia looked deeply at Urza. Tell me what you know of the Thran. Urza's posture and voice took on the aspect of a child answering a teacher's question in a classroom. The Thran existed thousands of years ago. They created incredible items and tools. Few of these creations are still around. But who were they? Takasia pressed him. Were they human? Urza did not hesitate. Absolutely they were human. Takasia came back with, how do you know that for certain? After searching his thoughts, Urza had to admit he was just making an assumption. Takasia continued on. No one knows for certain. The desert people believe that the Thran were gods who brought them to this world. Nothing concrete though. The Thran could have been any race. Mishra excitedly stated, I hope it turns out that they're minotaurs. Urza shook his head. Takasia did not allow the conversation to get sidetracked. We have discovered Thran power stones and parts of their language, but curiously, no artworks have been recovered, and there's no sign of where they went. Just pieces of their history left behind. Like this. As she spoke, she was touching an odd metal head that rested upon her desk. Fascinated, Mishra abruptly lunged forward, grabbing up the artifact. Takasia started to lean forward. The words stopped forming on her lips, but before she could make more than the tiniest sound, Urza had already leapt on top of Mishra. Drop it! It might be dangerous. Mishra shot back. If it was dangerous, then why is it just sitting out in the open on her desk? Urza wasn't having it. It's probably fragile. Put it down so you don't break it. Mishra retorted, if it breaks, it's because you are on top of me. At this point, Urza lost his composure and bellowed at Mishra. Hand it over! Never! Cried Mishra. Takasia slammed her hands down on the desk. This ends now! In a heartbeat, the skull was back on the desk, and the boys were staring up at her wide-eyed. You two have too much energy being put to ill use. You will work in the kitchen to start. Any more trouble from you, and I'll let Bly have you. The boys nodded sheepishly, looking embarrassed. Excellent. Now get going. There are piles of potatoes that need peeling. Takasia watched with amusement as the boys left her tent. So different, those two. Urza, the protective and serious older brother, Mishra, less cautious and more exuberant as the younger of the two. As her thoughts about the boys rolled through her mind, she noticed the skull on her desk was faintly glowing now. Before the boys had handled it, there was a long crack running through the Thran power crystal that was housed in the skull. Somehow, the crystal's damage had been fixed. The stone was whole once again and was emitting the soft glow she had noticed. Over the next 6 years, the boys settled into life guided by Takasia. Urza had devoted himself to scholarly pursuits, learning anything and everything about the Thran. He studied every artifact and even sorted through the trash pile of scraps left over from the dig site. He had found multiple items that were not trash, but actually belonged with some of the discovered artifacts. His curiosity knew no bounds. Takasia once caught him taking apart one of her onulets. "Fix it! Now!" she said angrily. Mishra decided to help out, and both brothers spent the night reassembling the onulet. Afterwards, it seemed improved, walking with a much more smooth and natural set of movements. Mishra also grew in his own right, taking a different path than Urza. Mishra would dig and hunt for new artifacts and hints of the Thran. He spent more and more time away exploring possible new locations. He did this so much that he developed the ability to assess a possible dig site with such proficiency that he could predict how deep they would have to go to find Thran remnants, and he was almost always right. Mishra also developed more socially than Urza, befriending students and the desert dwellers known as the Philagi. The Philagi's reverence for the Thran made Mishra view them as they did, godly beings. Mishra had also grown to be physically stronger and tougher from all the time he spent out in the desert. Over time, the two young men had become an integral part of the camp, acting as leaders and mentors for all of the students. Takasia was pleased. It allowed her more time for her studies. One day, the news came through that the boy's father had died. The two boys reacted quite differently. Urza barely even looked up from the Thran device. After he spent a moment absorbing the news, he returned to his task. Mishra, on the other hand, reacted with wild emotion, fleeing into the desert. Later that day, Urza went to see Mishra, and they sat together in the darkness, watching the moon. They never spoke of it again, and both brothers knew better than to expect any kind of inheritance from their stepmother. Not long afterwards, word came to Mishra through the Philagi diggers that a torrential downpour had unearthed what appeared to be a Thran machine. Takasia and the brothers headed an expedition to recover this relic of the Thran. Takasia looked it over when they arrived, and mused about it being some kind of boat. It had long poles that could be oars, and some broken but mostly intact sails. She was surprised to hear Urza instantly disagree. "This is a flying device, I am sure of it." It took them a week to excavate the Thran relic, and once they were able to see the entire thing, Takasia was forced to admit that Urza had been correct. Those were definitely wings, not sails. The relic was against all odds mostly intact. The tail had been ruined, and more importantly, the relic's power stone had been crushed. Takasia decided to name the flying device an ornithopter. They needed to get the ornithopter back to the encampment as fast as possible. The desert contained serious danger. Giant rocks, birds so large they could carry off a horse with ease, desert raids from those Philagi who thought what they did with the relics of the gods was blasphemy were also a big concern. Luckily, they were able to transport the ornithopter without attracting unwanted attention. Urza set to removing and repairing the housing that held the ornithopter's power stone, while Mishra dived into rebuilding the physical frame. Unfortunately, the ruined tail had yet to be puzzled out by either of them. The two brothers worked in tandem, switching between different tasks. Urza would figure out how the wires functioned and the placement of them as well, thus leading to the realization that the wings actually required thin wooden struts. They decided to use candlewood for the purpose because it was both light and flexible, perfect for a flying machine. Mishra decided to head back to where the ornithopter was originally found, and he managed to uncover additional fragments of the wings. The broken wood and frayed wire that he had uncovered proved Urza's theory. Unfortunately for them, the tale of the relic still continued to confound them. Hours and hours spent going over the ornithopter's design got them nowhere. Ultimately, it would take another full 8 months for them to figure out the mysteries of the tail and to fully rebuild the flying craft. They took the healed power stone that came from the old metal skull they wrestled over on their first day in the encampment, and they placed it in the ornithopter's housing. The ornithopter was complete. It also happened to be the last day of the year, and they were ready for their first test flight. Excitement hung in the air as the brothers debated who would go first. Urza stated he would go first, as he understood how the Power Stone housing worked. Mishra met that by stating that the controls were difficult and required strength to maneuver. But Urza wasn't giving up. "I weigh less." Mishra growled back, "I am stronger." But Urza was dogged. "I'm strong enough to work the levers." Mishra wasted no time coming back, and I know how to work the Power Stone. Still, Urza was not giving up. I am eldest. Mishra grimaced as he said, not today. It's my birthday. We're equal. Up until now, Takasia had stood back hoping the brothers would sort it out on their own, but she could see they would do this all day and night if she let them. She broke into their argument. If you two can't come to terms, I shall fly it myself, and we will see if these old bones of mine survive the journey. This had the immediate effect of sobering the boys. They stopped speaking for the moment and stared at her, and then without hesitation, both boys pointed at each other and in unison said, "Let him go first." Takasia was touched by their concern, but the boys would have launched into another argument if something wasn't done. She decided for them with a coin flip. It was determined Urza would go first, and Mishra didn't sulk. Not too much anyway. Urza walked into the clearing where the ornithopter was located, and he clambered into the pilot's housing. The ornithopter rumbled as he activated the Power Stone controls. Nothing else happened for a long moment, then abruptly the ornithopter hopped. Mishra stared with envy as the ornithopter hopped a few more times, each hop gaining greater altitude. The ornithopter's wings stirred up dust clouds, and then suddenly the ornithopter was airbound, sounding somewhat like a metallic bird from the sounds of the wires straining. Urza locked the wings into a spread-out position and proceeded to glide in lazy circles around the camp. Only once did he lose altitude when he hit a pocket of colder air, but that minor problem was the only issue he encountered. All in all, his first test flight was roughly 10 minutes long. As soon as he landed, Mishra bounded out to the ornithopter, but Urza stood in front of the pilot's housing. We should inspect everything to ensure it's all in good working order. Mishra's face was stony after Urza's proclamation, but Takasia interjected. Urza, let Mishra have his turn. Urza nodded and immediately stepped out of Mishra's way, but leaned in to give him a pointer. The right lever needs more force than the left. Mishra beamed at him and waved him away. Move away, brother! As he quickly grabbed the controls. Urza barely made it clear before the ornithopter fired straight up into the air in one giant leap. Urza winced. He could hear the sound of creaking wood and straining wires quite clearly. Urza protested to Takasia. We should have inspected it first. Takasia smiled kindly back at him. This was the wisest course of action, all things considered. Mishra's flight was different than Urza's. He really pushed the ornithopter to its limits, diving and banking, swooping about. Quite the contrast to Urza's flight, where Urza had tried to keep the flying craft perfectly level and sturdy. After circling the camp a few times, Mishra flew off into the desert, disappearing from sight. Takasia thought perhaps the steering mechanism had broken. Urza ran off to climb a nearby hill to get a better vantage point, muttering about how foolish Mishra could be. He only made it halfway up the hillside before Mishra reappeared on the horizon. When Mishra finally landed the craft, Urza started to tear into him. Are you crazy? What you did is incredibly dangerous. You could have been attacked by rocks or marooned in the desert. Mishra was unfazed by his brother's concern, his excitement showing through. Breathlessly, he said, I had to get a closer look at the drawings. The anger left Urza's face to be replaced with confusion. Mishra went on. Out in the desert, there are giant pictures of genies and dragons and other things like minotaurs. Did you not see them? Urza, not wanting to be outdone by his brother, said, I was more focused on the ornithopter during my flight. But he sounded quite defensive. Mishra plowed on. They surround a great hill. It has all the signs of it being an ancient Thran encampment, and the Philology I've spoken to have never mentioned anything of its like. Urza was barely paying attention at this point. He was more concerned about the ornithopter, and he set about inspecting the wings. Takasia put a gentle hand on his shoulder and pulled him away. There is time for that tomorrow. Tonight, we celebrate. In the digger encampment, a great bonfire was built, and the encampment hummed with excitement. After a year of hard work, something truly tangible had been accomplished. There was song and dance. The Philology diggers taught the Argivian youth a traditional dance, but the revelers had imbibed too much to do more than shuffle and flail awkwardly, to great laughter. Mishra regaled an enraptured audience with details of his flight. As a result, Takasia was approached by many excited youth who wished to experience flight for themselves. Out on the fringe of the celebration stood Urza, not partaking of any joyful activities. Takasia walked over. "Are you not enjoying the party?" Urza looked at her levelly. "It's fine, but I'm worried about the ornithopter. I want to upgrade." Takasia interrupted him. "There are many days ahead to make these improvements. Tonight is a time to share your happiness." She was surprised when Urza abruptly blurted out, "I wasn't trying to stop Mishra from having his turn." Takasia gave him a motherly smile. "I know." Urza went on, "I still think we should have checked before his flight. He could have been hurt." Takasia looked deep into Urza's eyes and softly said, "Mishra just wants to be your equal." Again, Urza protested. "I was just exercising caution." Takasia's return question gave him pause. If Mishra had gone first, would you have waited? Urza stood there quietly and made no reply as the firelight danced in his eyes. Well, my friends, that wraps up the first installment of the Brothers War lore. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you like what's going on this channel, consider supporting us on Patreon. And remember, my friends, lore is life.